The intermittent flashing of the orange light attached to the top of the traffic cone had jarred Tom from a deep sleep several times during the night. In his confused, drunken state, he'd mistakenly taken it to be an alarm clock and pressed down on it several times to operate the snooze function that didn't exist because, well, it was a traffic cone, after all. The 3-foot garden gnome dressed as a Scottish Highlander didn't appear overly impressed with the current situation, particularly due to the fact that half of his nose was currently missing, and Tom hadn't dared to check beneath his impressive kilt to see if anything was also missing. This was truly a mystery. Not the fact that he'd somehow acquired a traffic cone with flashing light, an oversized garden gnome, and what also appeared to be a painting of Winston Churchill, though it was difficult to make out in his hungover state, not to mention someone had drawn on with permanent marker a moustache, spectacles, and a mohawk, muddying things further. No, the true mystery, as he sat with his back against the living room wall, was how he'd come home with the left leg of his trousers completely missing. It wasn't as if they'd been torn off in a frenzy, either. This was a precision removal that a seamstress would have been proud of. Confusing the situation further was the fact that he only had his right shoe, and that it was presently on his left foot. Little wonder, then, that he'd felt some discomfort from that area. "Ahem," said Carol, standing over Tom with that "what the actual hell are you doing" expression etched in no uncertain terms over her face. Tom glanced up to Carol and then to his other housemate, Mike, who stood a pace behind her and evidently on his way to work. "Morning. I don't suppose there's any tea in pot, Carol," said Tom. "And you don't happen to know where they came from?" he said, pointing to the gnome and the traffic cone. Carol was in her nurse's uniform, as petite as she ever was, no more than 5'3", but she looked concerned as she leaned toward him, grabbing him by the hands and pulling him to his feet. Now he was standing upright. It was obvious to everyone how dishevelled he was. They could see that his trouser leg was missing, but they'd yet to notice the absence of his shoe. Tom's black polo shirt was torn, revealing red marks on his chest. His styled black hair was unkempt, as was the stubble on his face. In contrast, Mike was dressed in an immaculate black suit, with an open-necked white shirt and shoes that had evidently been polished with pride. Much taller than Tom, he looked over his thin-rimmed glasses and shook his head. "Tom, you are a mess." "Are you hurt?" asked Carol as she walked around him, trying to look for any sign of injury. Tom walked toward the black leather chair and sat with his back to the large sash window, his crooked posture flooded with light. "No, well, I don't think so. My head hurts a lot, though." Now Carol could see that there was no permanent damage. Her face turned from compassion to frustration. She sat next to Tom and put her hand gently on his knee. "Tom, you have to stop this. You're 35 years old. You're emaciated. You're not eating right. I know I'm not your mother, but you should take a look at yourself." Tom ran his hands through his hair. "I know. I don't know what happened. I went out with a couple of the guys from work for a few pints. And then this. You two standing over me." "You staggered in at about 2 a.m, said Mike. "You obviously don't remember waking me up to ask if I wanted a bit of your pizza or a whiskey." Tom shook his head and wondered what he'd done with the pizza box. He looked up at Mike and apologized, feeling a combination of nausea and remorse. Although he was no stranger to hangovers, this was a particularly bad one. But it wasn't just the hangover. He was also embarrassed that he couldn't remember coming home, and that it wasn't even the weekend yet. Blanking out for hours was the norm in his 20s, but what he dreaded most was the following day, when someone would inevitably relate to him his awful drunken behaviour from the night before.